Newcastle Castle occupies a strange position in the city centre. So strange that some people can't believe we have a castle in town at all. And yes, that is true. The number of people I've met who are confused to hear that there is actually a castle that gives Newcastle its name. Various buildings have stood on the site for centuries, dating back to the Romans and their Pons Aelius fort. Robert Curthose, the eldest son of William the Conqueror, originally founded Newcastle Castle in 1080. That early castle was made from wood, and builders then rebuilt the castle in stone between 1168 and 1178. It has been a castle, a prison, a beer cellar and Civil War stronghold, and now it's a visitor attraction and one that I highly recommend seeing if you can. For example, one of its more unusual features is its well. Not so odd you might think, but what makes it strange is its location on the second floor. The well is some 100 feet deep, making it difficult to poison the water supply. It is of course an unsurprising detail when we learn that the castle's architect, Morris the engineer, also designed the mighty Dover Castle. But as with any English castle, stories both sad and strange abound within Newcastle Castle. Let's examine 3 of its legends as part of our exploration of folklore found within cities in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. I do hope that you're well, and this particular episode is quite a fun one in my mind because we've gone from dealing with natural disasters in the first week of this theme to 2 examples of music hall songs and their impact on Tyneside, and now we're having a look at something that's been standing there throughout all of this, and that is the castle. I remember back in the day we used to refer to it just as the keep because that was what it was, but now it's referred to as Newcastle Castle. I did call it a medieval castle at the end of the last episode, and I think medieval is one of those weird words that kind of sometimes gets thrown about a bit. No one's really sure when it refers to. And largely it's between the 5th and the late 15th centuries. So yes, the castle does fall within that particular time span. And I think with this one, we're not necessarily looking so much at the legends of the city as a whole, but rather the legends associated with the building that gives the city its name. So it does represent Newcastle in quite a lot of ways. It is, as I said in the introduction, really worth visiting if you can. There are cracking views from the roof in particular. It is not unfortunately accessible because it is a medieval building, let's be honest. But if you can visit, then I do recommend that you do so. And we're going to start off with the first legend, which is a bit of a funny one because it's almost the absence of a legend to explain something that then creates the legend, and that is the bloodstained chamber. So if you head up to the second floor of the castle and go into what's known as the Great Hall, you will see from standing in the narrow doorway, there's a flight of stairs that heads towards a really wide window on the other side of the hall. It's kind of diagonally across from where you're standing. And if you go up the steps towards the window, you'll then see that there's a dogleg up another few steps towards a doorway and a corridor. If you follow that corridor, which is quite narrow but also very short, you'll find yourself in a small cramped room. It does have a window, but it also has dark red brownish stains that pepper the wall in the corner. Now this corner faces the door, and this is what gives the room its nickname of the Bloodstained Chamber, according to Vanessa Histon, a historian. No one is entirely sure if these stains are in fact blood or rather deposits of stone that just gives the stone its rusty look. There are some suggestions that they're simply traces of iron in the sandstone, which is possible, but the stains do have something like hard edges, so people like to think that they may actually be splashes of blood and so on. I have also put the image on screen if you're watching this on YouTube. I don't know where I stand on it because people talk about it being head height, but I actually think it's more kind of torso height, but that's based on me being 5'6", so there we go. So could it be blood? Who knows? But given the castle's position during the Civil War and also on the frontier with Scotland, it's possible that the room once held prisoners. After all, the position of the holes in the wall and the corridor show that there would be a bar against the innermost door, which is helpful for keeping people in the room rather than allowing anyone to come and go freely. There aren't any records to explain the stains, unfortunately, although you could argue that if they were from something nefarious, would anyone really have wanted to write that down? So, who knows? Some people suggest that staff use the room to store powder, even though it's only accessible from the Great Hall. But you then have to ask the question, why would a powder store have its own latrine? Other people think that the room provided lodgings for the servants of visiting officials, which again is possible given the presence of both a window and a latrine. So why would you need to use such thick bars on the doors of a servant's room? Of course, given the long life of the castle, there's no reason why it wasn't a powder store, servants' lodgings and a prison cell, just at different points in its history. And I think we sometimes get a little bit hung up on what was this room used for without asking the question, at which point in time? So there's that to think about. So there isn't any specific legend about the marks, only the suggestion that they might be bloodstains. And this is one of those really cool examples where the presence of something odd has generated folklore without there actually necessarily being anything to back it up. But your brain can then fill in the gaps instead. And obviously this is a folklore podcast, so it's entirely acceptable for me to share something and go, but we just don't know, because that's the point of folklore. Our next story, on the other hand, there is definitely historical evidence for. But what happened in this particular instance did go on to inspire legends and so on. And this is the idea of the castle as a notorious prison. And if you see it in the eerie twilight of winter, it is not hard to imagine it as a prison at all. And between 1400 and 1812, it was exactly that. So in 1400, the Crown granted Newcastle city status. But thanks to a quirk of politics, the castle and the Castle Garth area remained part of Northumberland. And the Garth is just another word for yard, and it's basically everything that would have gone from the castle itself to the walls. So while any prisoners in Newcastle went to Newgate Prison, which is where the Gate Entertainment Complex now stands if you're curious, Northumbrian prisoners went to the castle. So the original castle hall stood on the site now occupied by the Vermont Hotel, which was previously County Hall for Northumberland County Council before the council moved to Morpeth. And after sentencing, guards would then walk prisoners across the yard and put them in the guard room on the ground floor of the castle. Over the years, people have called the guard room the garrison room, and it's now called the cellar. It does sometimes host medieval tavern nights, which seem to go down quite well, so if any ghosts do remain, at least they do get to enjoy the odd sing-song and storytelling. But in earlier centuries, we can only guess at the conditions in this particular space, and you can see where there would have been things attached to the wall to prevent prisoners from moving, and reformer John Howard visited the castle in 1777 and absolutely condemned the authorities for allowing such horrible conditions. After all, legend has it that the room was cold, dark, filthy and crowded, and vicious criminals would sometimes rub shoulders with otherwise decent debtors, so there wasn't any kind of separation between types of prisoner. There wasn't any separation between men and women either, which completely appalled Howard. And according to legend, a child was conceived in the jail in 1625. We can only imagine what went on then. Or maybe not if you'd rather not imagine it. But even worse, the guards sometimes opened the prison for a sixpence admission so that locals could see selected prisoners. And we also saw things like this with Bedlam as well in the Bedlam episode. So again, capitalism ends up exploiting people. But we are going to head back to 1527 for our next legend, and this is the one of a prison break. And it did actually happen as well. Sir William Lyle of Felton in Northumberland appears to have become something of an outlaw. I did try to find out what actually happened, but the sources get quite confused, making it a bit difficult to figure out the truth of it all. But it does seem that Lyle disputed the authority of other people over his land, and it seems like he didn't like other people telling him how he should run his own land and so on. And he felt he was the sole lord of his lands, so when someone took some of his cattle, he then took cattle from them, and it all sort of devolves into people being very, very annoyed at him. So in doing all of this, Lyle and his son Humphrey fell foul of Cardinal Wolsey. And they must have made some kind of promise that they were going to behave themselves, because one of the records talks about them breaking their bond and then essentially offended again. So they obviously committed whatever crime they'd been held up for before, which I think sounds a lot like cattle theft. The Lyles found themselves imprisoned in Newcastle. Obviously, remember, this is the era of the border reivers, where law and order in this part of the country and into the borders pretty much operated on its own footing, as it were. I am going to do some more stuff on the border reivers in future, because they're a particular period of history and a particular group of people that I think get really massively overlooked. So look forward to that at some point in the future, probably later on this year though. But either way, as I say, the Lyles found themselves imprisoned in Newcastle. It's likely that they weren't held in the guard room, because obviously they would have some degree of status, but it's more likely that they were held in one of the cells within the neighbouring Black Gate complex, and that's literally the postern gate, which is still there, which would have been one of the entry points through the walls. What came next is the stuff of legend, yet actually happened. So the Lyles apparently overcame the guards, freed other prisoners, and then caused mayhem as they rampaged to freedom, taking their new companions with them, and apparently they headed to Scotland. And in some versions of the story, the Armstrongs accepted William and his son Humphrey as honorary Armstrongs, and this is something that we often see with Reivers, where you could make an allegiance and become part of the family without having to actually have any kind of bloodline, so it wasn't based on blood ties, it was more based on allegiances. But in 1528, the Earl of Northumberland recaptured them and sentenced Lyle to be hanged, drawn and quartered. Humphrey, on the other hand, was only 12 or 13 at the time, so he managed to attain a pardon, retook the family position, got a knighthood and restored the family estates. So Humphrey seems to have escaped a lot of his father's fate, partly because of the fact he was only 12 or 13 at the time. But yeah, Lyle does not get out of that particularly well. But the escape did potentially inspire another legend about the castle, and this one was related in a book, Dark Tales of Old Newcastle by Pamela Armstrong, which I actually got in 1991, so that shows how long I've had that one. But in that story, various lords were implicated in the Rising of the North, a 1569 rebellion against Elizabeth I. In the story, a man named Jock Armstrong helped these lords to escape. Unfortunately, someone then betrayed him, and the castle garrison promised to execute him the following day. Someone sent word to the Armstrongs of Liddesdale, so there's the Armstrongs again, who apparently mounted a raid during the night and sprang Jock from prison, and they spirited him away to the borders. I do want you to bear in mind that Liddesdale is in the county of Roxburgh in southern Scotland, and it's basically a 90-minute drive or so from between Newcastle and Jedburgh, which lies in Roxburghshire, so you do have to wonder how long it might take a band of horse-mounted reivers to do the trip. So there's little factual evidence that this jailbreak ever happened, so it is possible it was inspired by the Lyle story instead, but I thought it was quite interesting that something that sounds like the stuff of legend actually happened and then went on to inspire a completely different legend, so that's quite cool. Our final story is the one that I've been dying to get to, because it turns out that there's actually quite a lot of inaccuracies in the legend that people know about this. And it happens a lot of the time because lots of the stories around Newcastle Castle have become garbled over time. It stood there for over 800 years. This is bound to have happened. And a lot of the ghost stories in particular can't be verified. So if you are familiar with the castle and wonder why I haven't included the tale of the Poppy Girl, this is why. We have no way of knowing if she ever existed, especially since different levels of violence appear in the story depending on the audience. And indeed what actually happened to this poor girl changes depending on the version of the story. But the particular tale of the flying donkey, on the other hand, is based on a nugget of truth, but the details have become muddled, and in some ways the truth of it is actually even more interesting than the legend. So I'll tell you the legend first, and then I'll tell you what actually happened. So let's head back to 14th of December 1733. We've seen adverts proclaiming that an amazing spectacle is about to take place. A man will fly from the roof of the keep. So we've all gathered in the grounds at the foot of the castle, and a figure with man-made wings appears at the top of the 100-foot tower. It launches into the air. Is he going to fly after all? Gasps of astonishment turn to screams as the figure plummets into the crowd below. Only it's not the showman, it's his donkey. Miraculously, the donkey survives the showman's test flight, but the spectator it lands on isn't so fortunate. It turns out the showman has had second thoughts, realising he's never tested his wings, so instead he straps them to the donkey and pushes that off the roof instead. The showman never does make his advertised flight. Except that's not what actually happened. Wings were not involved, but the flying donkey was. As I like to do, I wanted to have a look and see what the newspapers of the time said. So I went off and had a look at the Newcastle Courant, who did write about this when it happened. So on December 14, 1733, so that is correct, a performer known only as the Flying Man performed a stunt by which he flew from the top of the castle. And as local historian Dave Silk explained, these flying men were actually quite common, and what they did was they strung ropes between high places and somewhere near the ground, and then they swung down them, rather like an 18th century zipline, to achieve flight. So in this particular instance, the so-called flying man did perform his own flight, much to the delight of the audience. So he did go down the rope after all, he did fly, but he then decided to up the ante. Somehow, and sadly the newspaper article doesn't explain how, he sent a donkey down the zip line. One can only imagine the contraption required to do so. Surprisingly, the donkey's flight also worked, but unfortunately the crowd below failed to get out of the way in time, and the Newcastle Courant explained how they didn't move, and I quote, though a very great and timely warning was given, end quote. The weight attached to the donkey knocked several people over, while others ended up bruised, and sadly a girl died. It is quite interesting in the article that the Krant very, very heavily blames the audience for not moving rather than the showman for sending a donkey down a zipline, but there we go. The idea of an 18th century zipline is actually fascinating enough on its own, especially given the flight of both the flying man and the donkey were ultimately successful. I'm not sure how or even why anyone added the concept of a donkey wearing man-made wings to the story, but that is the one that persists. That is the one that you will hear people telling on ghost walks. That is the one even that Vanessa Histon included in her book where I first encountered the story. But the actual story of a zipline, I think, is even weirder. So there we go. That is the story of the flying donkey of Newcastle Castle, which I think is one that will probably stay with you for a while. The fact that it appears in the newspaper just makes it even better. But what do we make of the legends of Newcastle Castle? Like I say, this is only 3 of them. There's many, many more. But I thought, we can't exactly do an entire month on them. So we're just picking these 3. But Newcastle Castle is a monument to the stories of the region because it has seen around 850 years of history, which has been particularly bloody and violent history. It intersects with stories of border reivers, local criminals, and even William Wallace, whose genitals were reputedly hung from the walls. But history gives rise to legends. The castle's ghost stories are almost impossible to verify, although its legends do at least have a basis in fact. So William Lisle and the Flying Man were both real people appearing in the historical record, and then both went on to inspire further stories. While Lisle has faded into obscurity, the Flying Donkey, unsurprisingly, remains a popular local tale. All of these stories preserve the history of this fascinating and often sad building, and they also lead us to look outwards into the wider Castle Garth and the city beyond. So if folklore can become a gateway into local history, then it can also be the bridge between ourselves and the people of the past who encountered these events before becoming bystanders in the legends. And who knows, maybe we'll become bystanders in legends in the future. I do also have a bonus episode about the Castle Garth because I did that for my Patreon supporters. So if you want access to the Castle Garth bonus episode, which is actually a recorded talk with lots of images rather than just a single episode in the normal format, if you would like access to that, you can obviously become a supporter of Fabulous Folklore on Patreon, and then you'll get access to the well over 70 bonus episodes that there are now, or you can just buy that one individually depending on what your budget is. But I hope you've enjoyed that particular story of the castle. It's an absolutely fascinating building. And I like the fact that this covers 3 different types of story that we have associated with this building. And if you're in the UK, I guarantee there will be weird stories like this about a notable building in your area. Whether it's a castle or not, there'll be something odd attached to something, because there always is. And if you do find anything, please do feel free to let me know. And this has been the whole point of this particular theme, to go look how we can look for folklore using local history as our lens. So yes, I've used Newcastle as a case study, but you can then use similar principles for wherever you are. And also, even if you're not in the UK, there'll be weird stuff attached to buildings near you, because anywhere that you find people, you find stories. So it's always quite cool to see what people find. I have posted the bonus episode for this month, which you can get access to on Substack or Ko-fi or Patreon, so anywhere that you choose to support. That one is about 2 of Newcastle's cunning men, so this is much more in line of what we usually look at on the podcast. So these are 2 practitioners of the occult, essentially. So that's Peter Banks of the 1670s and Jackie Johnson of the early 19th century. So that is available as well. If you would like to support on Patreon, Substack or Ko-fi, you're more than welcome to sign up and have a look at that one as well. And again, like I've said before, any support goes to help me run the podcast, because it does take quite a lot of my time to put these episodes together. And obviously there's all the annoying back-end costs like website hosting and all that kind of thing as well, which is unfortunately a necessary evil. And I don't really want to run ads on the podcast, because I don't get paid per play like musicians do. Support on these different platforms is basically how it all keeps going. So that is class. If you can't afford to support, like I have to say in the outro, feel free to just recommend it to people, share the episodes, all that kind of thing. That's all super useful as well. So there's tons of ways to support depending on what works for you. Next week, we're going to have a look at Ralph Headley, who is a local artist who did some beautiful paintings in the 19th century. But what I want to have a look at, because he did paintings of Newcastle, but also some of the more rural stuff in Northumberland. So he does capture what we would consider like classic folklore. But I wanted to go through some of his paintings and what he's captured about more urban folklore, if that makes sense. through his paintings. So we're going to have a look. And I know people quite like the art-based episodes anyway, and I will show the images on screen if you are watching on YouTube, and the images will be in the blog post if you're listening to the audio. So hopefully you'll enjoy having a look at some art next week. And then next month, the theme is children's lore. So I have put the link to the form where you can tell me your children's folklore. Just to clarify, children's folklore is the folklore shared between children. It's generated by them, it's shared by them, and it's maintained by them. It's not what adults tell kids. It's what kids tell each other. So what I'm looking for is either what you remember from when you were little, like things that you used to tell each other, things that you believed, games you played, traditions you followed, things like that, or what you've observed from your own children or children that you're around regularly. So it's not how you direct them to play, it's how they choose to play on their own and things like that. It can be a bit more difficult to get children's lore out of children because of the fact that they don't always like sharing it with adults because of the nature of children's folklore. So it'll be interesting to see how many people can at least share that. But it is going to be quite cool to see what people remember from like the 70s, 80s and 90s, because a lot of the current children's lore tends to often focus on like the 50s and 60s. So this will be quite cool to see what people remember from later periods and from different parts of the world. So there is a Google form if you'd like to contribute anything, and that is linked in the show notes. But anyway, I will see you next week when we go and have a look at the work of Ralph Headley. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. I don't get paid per play of the podcast like musicians do, so if you'd like to support the podcast so I can keep it ad-free and help me pay for all the annoying stuff like web hosting and cover the hours it takes me to make these episodes, then you can buy me a coffee on Ko-fi or become a member of the Fabulous Folklore family by becoming a paid supporter on Ko-fi, Patreon and Substack. Or you can leave a review, tell a friend, or share episodes on social media for free. It all helps.